This is Ebony Bennett, and before we start today's Follow the Money episode, I wanted to let you know that the Australia Institute's end of financial year appeal is on right now. And between now and June 30th, every single dollar you donate to the Australia Institute will be matched dollar for dollar until we reach our target of $70,000. That means if you donate $10, the Australia Institute receives $20. If you donate $50, the Australia Institute receives $100. So if you donate right now, you can double the impact of your donation. The Australia Institute and this podcast is supported by listeners like you. We aren't funded by government or political parties. We primarily rely on donations, big and small, from our supporters to fund all of our research and advocacy. Whether it's a monthly donation of $10 or a one-off donation of $100 or $1,000, every single dollar you donate helps fund research that matters. The Australia Institute is one of the country's most influential public policy think tanks. And whether it's this podcast, our popular webinar series, or our top quality research, the Institute is always leading the debate with big new ideas or helping engage the public with issues that are important to them. On this podcast, we really try to bring our research straight to your ears, completely free for anyone to access, and invite you behind the scenes of politics to peel back the curtain and explain the really big, important issues in ways that are accessible to everyone. And we love our listeners, so thank you for listening, and please consider making a donation at australiainstitute.org.au. Every donation of $2 or more is tax deductible. Now, onto the episode.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. Won't hurt.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day, welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we'll be talking about accountability. You know, that idea, that quaint idea that government take responsibility for its mistakes and be open with the public about how it is operating.
It's who's in charge. Who is in charge of vaccinating aged care staff?
Senator Gallagher.
Senator, you can harangue me all you like. I'm trying to answer your
You're the
question.
aged care minister.
Yeah, Senator.
You fund it, you regulate it. How can it not be your job to ensure that the workers get the vaccine?
Because it's not what you're proposing is not a natural step. We are running a national program. Again, you can try and verbal
Well, just
me.
tell me, are you responsible, yes or no?
Well, it's not a yes or no answer, Senator.
The key issues here has been lack of transparency and a lack of trust, because there needs to be, I agree, transparency so that we know where the problems are.
And people are entitled, I think, to know what is informing government decisions.
That's why we've spent quite a bit of time today going into some detail, explaining the qualifications around the information that we've provided to the public today, but in particularly to the media, and so we will continue to be upfront with Australians.
State and federal responses to the pandemic really have helped restore a lot of trust in government, at least temporarily, as the Morrison government and the state governments work together to overcome the pandemic and respond to the economic crisis that followed, including the recession. But really, the Morrison government isn't known necessarily for its commitment to transparency and accountability. Over the past year or years, we've seen multiple scandals like the sports rorts, where it appears the government is lavishing taxpayers' money on Liberal-held seats or seats targeted by the coalition. And during the pandemic, we've seen huge government spending programs that, let's be clear, are absolutely necessary, but are oftentimes quite opaque, making it difficult to judge their efficacy and necessity, I guess. So if you remember back to the beginning of the pandemic, Parliament stopped sitting.
Shouldn't stop us, because we're in a crisis, from being a democracy. And if we've got to stay at home while we're not doing virtual Parliament from home, you can't tell me in the 21st century that cannot be done.
As everyone was working from home, Parliament hadn't worked out how to sit in terms of being COVID safe. And at the beginning, they were making these big, huge, consequential decisions for all Australians, but there were little or no accountability mechanisms in place. So we're in a quite different spot at the moment, but accountability is all the more important as the federal government and national cabinet keep making huge decisions that affect people's everyday lives. So to talk about this important issue of accountability, I'm joined by Bill Brown, who leads the Australia Institute's new Democracy and Accountability Project. G'day, Bill.
Hey, Ebony.
So, Bill, I do want to go back to that time at the beginning of the pandemic, and we're all freaking out. We all started to work from home, and the Parliament suspended all sittings, yet the government, the Prime Minister and the state premiers were making some huge and consequential decisions like lockdowns, restrictions on travel, all kinds of things, and there was really no accountability mechanisms in place. What was happening at the time?
That's right. It's increasingly hard to remember now as we've moved on. But at the time, you had governments scrambling for what to do, how to respond to the crisis, and a huge debate on what appropriate measures were. You had government at the federal level committing to spend hundreds of billions of dollars, including most prominently on JobKeeper. And at the same time, Australia had suspended its parliament for significantly longer than most other places around the world. So you have that deficit there where you've got increasing powers, increasing responsibilities, and yet the lack of that elected oversight.
And so the Australia Institute back at that time looked at, for example, what New Zealand was doing and other jurisdictions. And what did we find and recommend at that time?
New Zealand quite quickly moved to set up a committee to oversee its government's response to COVID.
Well, good morning. Are we live, James?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, you are.
Well, good morning, members, and good morning, New Zealanders. Today is about health and the issues in relation to COVID-19 and health.
Kia ora tātou katoa.
It was a kind of tripartisan initiative, supported fully by the government, even though it would be chaired by the opposition leader, and was set up despite their parliament suspending for a much shorter period than our own. So the Australian Institute looked at that example, as well as some of the commentary that was happening around national cabinet, which was only in its recency at that point, and canvassed a few suggestions, one of which was to include many more people in the national cabinet process. At the very least, people were suggesting the opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, should be involved. Other suggestions were recommending a whole host of different current and former politicians be added. In the end, what Australia went for was similar to the New Zealand model, but a Senate committee that would oversee the process. So a little different, of course, because we've got a bicameral system, unlike New Zealand's, but a bit of the same thinking there.
Yeah, and so the idea being that, you know, it was a rapid crisis at the time. Things were moving very quickly, government spending a lot of money, making these huge and big decisions. And so therefore, the likelihood of making mistakes was probably greater, not that they would necessarily be deliberate, but that it would be important to have some oversight and accountability for those decisions that government was making.
That's right. And there was such a spirit of bipartisanship and cooperation at the time, but that doesn't mean that you hold back from pursuing the important issues and making sure that government spends its money wisely, as you say.
Good afternoon. I'm joined by the Minister for Health, Chief Medical Officer and the Secretary of the Department of Health. Good afternoon. I'm joined by a well-rested Chief Medical Officer. Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. It's been another very positive and meeting of the National Cabinet today. We've made a lot of progress over the course of this week. Today we held the 42nd meeting of the National Cabinet. Our next meeting will be held in person in Darwin. The National Cabinet is a red tape cutting organisation, and we've agreed today that the way we keep coming together, we get into the room, we get things done, and I thank my colleagues very much for their cooperation and support.
So I want to stick with this idea of national cabinet because, as you said, It's only been around for a year or so. It's an entirely new kind of function. Essentially, it's replaced COAG, the Council of Australian Governments. But we don't really have any rules or regulations set up around us. And you've been looking recently at a court case where Senator Rex Patrick is taking the federal government to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal over whether or not National Cabinet is truly a national cabinet in terms of freedom of information laws. What is that case about and why is it important?
You know, on some level, it's about nomenclature. Is the National Cabinet a cabinet? But it goes much deeper than that. And the provoking incident is that Senator Rex Patrick wanted to understand some of the details of how National Cabinet works, some of its internal documents. And his Freedom of Information request was blocked on the grounds of cabinet confidentiality.
Independent Senator Rex Patrick has been trying to get information from the government about its strategy.
Well, I've made a request to get access to the government's vaccine rollout strategy. You can see this is Greg Hunt's letterhead, and this is what the Australian government are prepared to share with the Australian public. And you can see that it's just blank page after blank page where they have redacted it.
His case basically turns on whether you can call something a cabinet or a committee of cabinet and thereby extend the whole norms that have built up over hundreds of years about what cabinet confidentiality means.
And apply it to this new body.
That's right, yeah, which originally was created kind of from COAG but concurrently with COAG, and then after a couple of months COAG was dissolved and National Cabinet is what we have now to replace it. And that's why it's particularly important that it has the same level of transparency that COAG operated under and can meet the same needs that we had with COAG.
Yeah, and does it meet that same level of accountability? Like, how did COAG used to operate? Is there a big gap in the accountability and transparency of the decisions?
I think there's a significant gap. COAG had responsibilities around reporting of decision-making, broader attendance at the meetings, not just the heads of government themselves, even the omission of a representative of local government, which was a standard part of COAG, but not of this new system, all go to show that what may have made sense as a reaction to COVID needs to be reconsidered as the kind of continuing institution that we have.
And what are the prospects? What do the legal people say about whether or not this court case will be successful?
I think there's a strong case put forward by Senator Rex Patrick and his representative, Geoffrey Watson, SC. They go to what looks like a cabinet and the history, the convention of cabinets. If the National Cabinet is indeed a committee of the federal cabinet, as the government suggests, it looks totally unlike any other committee of the federal cabinet that we've ever seen before. The most obvious ways is that it's not made up of members of the federal parliament who've been elected as part of the same government, who stand and fall together and stick by their decisions. And the Prime Minister himself has made the point that National Cabinet is like a bus and not everyone has to be on the bus when it leaves the station.
So we've decided that this notion of 100% absolute consensus on any issue is not a way that the National Cabinet can indeed work. Not everyone has to get on the bus for the bus to leave the station. But it is important the bus leaves the station, and we all agree on that. We all agree on that. Even when on occasion some might not want to get on, they know we need to keep moving forward. And that is supported, and that's what we agreed to do today.
You can't say the same thing about the federal cabinet, where you don't have ministers kind of jumping off partway through the bus trip and going their own way.
No, they'd probably lose their jobs if they did that.
Exactly. They'd be expected to. And it's also hard to see how National Cabinet can exist as a subset of the federal cabinet when all of these members of National Cabinet have their own responsibilities to their own parliaments. They can't stand and fall together when they're not all chosen by the same polity, the same legislature.
And this issue kind of hinges around freedom of information and access to some of those documents and decisions. Just quickly, I guess, for people who aren't maybe au fait with the freedom of information laws, the secrecy that operates around Cabinet, Australia has operated that system for quite a while, and ostensibly it's to protect the people making the decisions at the time from, I guess, the short-term consequences of politics, and perhaps give them that idea of, or the ability to make longer-term decisions. But that's not necessarily how all cabinets work around the world, is it?
I think there's an example closer to home even, which is here in the ACT, you've got a cabinet made up of Labor and Greens MLAs, and they've negotiated their own kind of adaptation of the system where they've got some alternatives to their kind of system. But you're right that cabinet confidentiality comes out of the Westminster system of government and doesn't necessarily apply to other executives. United States, for example, where the president chooses his or her own executive and doesn't have to answer to the legislature in the same way. Whereas the history of cabinets in Australia comes from the British tradition where you've got that executive coming out of the legislature.
And I think, I'm not quite sure how long cabinet in confidence lasts for, but it's many years. And there are other jurisdictions, correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps New Zealand, where there's actually a much shorter period between cabinet decisions and when they're made, when those documents that accompany it are made public.
Yeah, New Zealand releases its documents prepared for cabinet. I think it's something like 28 days after the final decision is
and ours
made.
is years, right?
Something like 30 years.
Yeah.
So 28 days, 30 years.
Big difference there.
Big difference, yeah.
Government ministers and government agencies are making decisions about all of us, and those decisions can fundamentally influence how we go about our day-to-day lives. In an open and democratic society such as the one we have, transparency in how those decisions are being made is important. The FOI Act is the vehicle by which every Australian has the ability to seek the information held by government which can show how these day-to-day decisions are being made about them.
Again, for people who kind of aren't familiar, freedom of information is a really important way to uncover happenings and workings of government decisions, all kinds of things. How do people use freedom of information and why is it important?
The use of freedom of information to get the workings of government exposed so that you do see how funding decisions are made, who's responsible for allocating the money. You've got, I think, sports frauds was revealed through freedom of information requests.
A lot of scandals end up being revealed this way.
We sometimes don't see it because it doesn't make the national news as often, but individuals sometimes use FOI laws for personal redress as well to find out the particulars of how decisions were made in cases that they're involved in. But yes, certainly you can see from the reporting that comes out of journalists every year that they make heavy use of freedom of information laws to make sure that they know how government's operating.
And overall, would you say that Australia's freedom of information laws are operating better and faster than in the past, or are we kind of heading in the other direction?
Definitely in the other direction. And you can see that from the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner. The OAIC is responsible for reviewing requests for FOI decisions to be reviewed. So if you end up getting stonewalled by a department or you disagree with the decision that they've made, you can go to the OAIC and
appeal that decision.
Exactly.
So basically you might write to a department and say, I'd like to see all the documents relating to X or Y decision, and they might write back and just say no.
Yeah.
What are some of the reasons that government might knock back a freedom of information request?
Well, there's the one pertinent to the National Cabinet, which is Cabinet in confidence.
Yep.
You also have that it could interfere with state-federal relations, and that's also been raised with this particular case. You've got, of course, important privacy concerns, so it's not appropriate to reveal the particulars of a person's information. National security comes up quite often. And there's a variety of others as well, but you can see from those, commercial in confidence is actually another important one. All of those are extremely prone to interpretation. And the courts have been quite strict about enforcing them, but for an individual person to get that point is pretty tricky.
Yeah.
That, however, hasn't stopped ABC boss David Anderson from claiming that FOI is being foiled by government secrecy.
Authorities have become adept at classifying documents as exempt and using go-slow techniques to delay publication.
And in an FOI that you guys provided me with, and I might just point out that that's the bit of the FOI that was partially redacted, and that's fully redacted, okay? Complete lack of transparency around that grant process.
We got back 49 pages, most of them black. Now, many pages were redacted because they were declared irrelevant by the department.
There was an FOI that was put in recent weeks about Scott Morrison's visit to the G20, and this is what they got back. Happy snaps from the G20 visit.
49 pages of mostly blacked out text. That is not how the Freedom of Information Act is designed to work.
If they try to tell you, it's a simple but serious question. Why don't they want the people who elect them and pay them to know what they're doing?
We've just recently had the budget. Was there any money set aside in that for improving freedom of information?
There was about $1 million set per year set aside for the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner to have a new position created, the FOI Commissioner, someone who's actually got a dedicated responsibility for overseeing their load of cases, because the Information Commissioner herself wears 3 different hats at the moment and is responsible for broader issues as well. And that's about time, because the OAIC's only resourced to look at about 800 FOI review requests each year, and they've projected they're going to get double that amount, 1,600, over the next few years. I don't know that this FOI Commissioner, as one person, is going to be able to fix that themselves, but it's a promising step.
But not enough, essentially.
Can you confirm that this $600 million was in the budget as a decision taken but not yet announced? And if not, where can I identify this expenditure in the budget?
Just give me a moment, please, Senator.
Sorry, Senator. Sean Sullivan, Deputy Secretary. We'll have to basically get that and get back to you as soon as possible as to where that is inside the budget papers.
You are kidding me.
I think there's a disappointing trend away from transparency, even in the approach that's taken to it publicly. So in talking about the privacy or secrecy provisions around the National Cabinet, you have the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, saying that politics is not a spectator sport. Well, in a democracy...
It should be.
It should be, exactly. Even around other cabinet mechanisms. So the Prime Minister has created a committee of cabinet of which he is the only permanent member. That's unprecedented to my knowledge and really goes against the kind of spirit of the system. It's important for people to be able to see what the government's up to and not be stonewalled. The laws is one part of that, but a strong Freedom of Information Act that is met by recalcitrance from public servants, where you get huge delays between responses, it takes a long time to get any kind of decision, let alone a satisfactory one, it goes to show that it's also a cultural issue. And so the more that we can expect honesty from our governments, the less we have to rely on strict legal interpretation and expensive court cases to get the information that we've ultimately paid for, that we're entitled to as members of a democracy.
Thanks, Bill. That's all we have time for today. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 8th of June 2021, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research, including the research from the Accountability and Democracy Program, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a NNT, and Bill Brown is at Brown with an E on the end, 90. That's Brown90. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macy, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Stay safe out there, everyone, and thanks for listening.